Welcome to the latest episode of Lateral Think, brought to you by Melbourne Athletic Development. Melbourne Athletic Development is a sports and injury management clinic based in Melbourne, Australia. To maximise your performance, optimise your injury management, contact the team at Melbourne Athletic Development. As many of you know, Jack and I have a very diverse understanding across multiple areas of practice, whether they relate to sports performance, say for instance with my background in track coaching, or with Jack and his background in yoga practice. We've combined a lot of this knowledge over time with our clinical and sports performance experiences to really develop what we do. And as you know, we love education. So what we've tried to do is take that knowledge and put it into an online learning community. We think this is important because it's an opportunity for people to interact, learn, and upskill as they try to improve the practice of what they do. So if this is something that you would be interested in doing, head to melbourneathleticdevelopment.com.au/education and get an understanding of how you can upskill your current practice. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Today we are extremely lucky to be joined by Professor Sophia Nimphius. Sophia, can you give us a little bit of a background about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both for inviting me on the show. It's a pleasure always. And I guess who you are and what you do, that can be a big answer.
Well, for you, it's a big question.
Yeah.
You do a lot of things.
So many things, and I think that's a positive, and I guess we'll get into that later. But my formal role and what I do day in and day out, a professor of human performance, and even in that human performance, what is that? It's pretty all-encompassing. So it's a multidisciplinary approach to understanding how we perform, and I do have a bias to how we perform physically. So that's my key. I guess my background. I started in strength and conditioning, moved into sports science, and now doing a lot of governance and leadership work, which makes you zoom out and figure out what is making an impact on, in this case, performance. And so that's kind of who I am and what I do. And I still coach on the side because I find it really valuable to just keep that hand in the day-to-day to remember what it really feels like when you make decisions. So still coaching more junior athletes now in softball.
What sports are you coaching in softball? Yeah. I do recall. Jack and I are very lucky to have been taught by you during our time doing the Masters at Edith Cowan. And I think both of us were really excited when you said that you were happy to come on because we had very, very enjoyable experiences working with you, particularly in the practical setting that you get to do as part of that course. But one of the things that I always thought was extremely valuable from even just my general perspective was the fact that you did have that nice combination of your academic background and your research, but you always seem to put it in the context of coaching because you were an athlete and you are a coach and you continue to combine the two. And I know that Jack sent through some questions to sort of prompt us, but one of the things was, how do you see that framework does assist you in terms of how those two things interact, particularly with how you design research especially some of the really cool things you've done in the past?
Yeah, I mean, it takes a long time to gather experiences across multiple areas. So it has been quite a journey, and it's not like I just popped out and I had like this Yoda-like view of having lots of experiences. But over time, I was really keen, and I just loved doing things and was happy to continually be learning. And I think that ironically, was planned, set me up to always realize you need multiple viewpoints in order to really come across not just with a good idea, lots of good ideas out there, but a good idea that people can actually implement. And I've kind of watched and made heaps of mistakes on both sides, like a great scientific idea that is totally impractical, and then a great practical idea that actually has so many things happening scientifically, you actually can't explain why or what is working in that. And I've done my best, as much as meeting in the middle has its challenges, to kind of try to take the best of both of those aspects, like what you can practically utilize and what you can scientifically explain or test as a hypothesis and go in the middle. And of course, being in the middle has its limitations as well. But I think for who I am and how I hope others to use the information, it's just been the limitation I'm happy to sit with is sitting in the middle.
Was that a process for you to go through where you had to be willing to accept that position? Because, as you said, it has compromise built into it. And there's some things that we do in a similar sense. I'm a coach as well. I coach track and field, and obviously, our background is physio as well as strength and conditioning. But you often have to put very different hats on when you are working in one versus the other. And I wouldn't give up those positions, even though it does compromise some of the ways in which I view things. Was that a very conscious decision for you? And what process did you have to go through with to get to that and be comfortable with it? Or is it still an evolution that you're trying to navigate?
I was going to start this by saying I reserve the right that everything I say in here, I might change my mind by tomorrow.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, but it's been a bit of that. I never remember struggling I never remember struggling to change my mind, in that while I'm a really pragmatic person, not that anyone cares, but I'm a Libra and I like weigh
so
up.
Are we.
No, really, this is bad. This is really bad. Weigh up both sides of the situation, and whether that has scientific premise and that's real or not, I definitely weigh up both sides. I'm very much kind of the scales legal framework where you're like, oh, this, then that, and then you have to make your conclusion. I've always really been like that. That's like that. It's a personality and I think personalities are more fixed, right? And emotions are variable, and that's like the difference. And that is just a personality of mine. So I think that was advantageous for me to settle in that professionally. I started out more in the applied, strength and conditioning, and things had to be things you were going to implement right there and then. And then I really did swing and get mentored by people that were very much in the research world. They liked strength conditioning, but they were way on the research side of it. They did little coaching probably, had coached and lifted and done things on their own for experiential learning. But as far as calling themselves a coach, I think they would say they're a scientist and be pretty strong with that. And I lived in that world for a little while after being in the other world. And then I kind of decided to find my own world. And that was falling into the middle. And it probably just lined up with my kind of personality trait. Whereas if that isn't inherent to you, it's something that probably takes a longer process. And you might struggle a lot more to be okay. Some people are more fixed or really, really swing to one side. And so to weigh up two things it can be a real struggle. And that's not wrong, right, and different. In fact, we need everyone across the spectrum in order to meet in the middle. Otherwise, there's no middle to be had. Yeah, I think it was inherent. So I can't take too much credit that it was so much planned work on my behalf, but I get better.
So was there any influence from, I feel like because you've had so many varied experiences, you've probably come across, and I know that you've actually worked with some really world-leading individuals, both across, the sporting coaching spectrum and also the research area. Were they encouraging of that, or was it something that, as I said, it just came natural to you and you were lucky in that sense that your personality drove your curiosity and your willingness to explore? Or were there certain key people that you actually can look back and say, no, they actually really pushed me to keep developing what was already naturally there?
I've definitely had a lot of influence that was advantageous for me to continue pushing to people that were okay continuing the conversation, where I always say, and this, and this, and I'm always and I always add something at the back end. I can't just let something rest. And And it takes a particular kind of human to tolerate someone who does that all the time. So, yeah, I will have to say, without just like name dropping humans that everyone would know, you just have to take my word. Now, you're gonna have to take my word for it because I find that weird. But I do have people that will challenge me, push back. They're like, I totally disagree with what you're saying, and I'll say, yeah, but and and but it'll be mutual, and we're okay to argue a point. And over time, funny enough, we probably move each other closer to one and another's views. With that said, don't take that as I've just been in this happy, wonderful, positive disagreement world where we all get along in the middle. I've had a ton of people that just could not sit with being in the middle. Like there had to be an extreme answer. And I have those people in my group too, and I'm okay with that. I can't tolerate that for a long period of time, but I need it because when I hear an extreme view, it really makes me revisit, am I as okay with my position, or should I be sliding towards that as well? Like, what is it that gives them all the support to put over there? And I do this one thing to myself, and you have to be in a great place to do it. But every once in a while, I will read material that is fundamental. Like if I have a left of center or a right of center view on a topic, like is strength important for sprinting? And I'm saying that because I think we're going to get to it.
Yeah.
I will read really extreme things that are far away from what I agree with, and I'll read the whole thing, and I'll be like, oh, that was a lot to take in. Because I find it makes me continue to reevaluate to make sure I don't hold crazy extreme views. And although I can't do it all the time, because sometimes it's like
it's very
torture.
draining. Yeah.
Yes, I do it sometimes, and I think it makes me practice argument. And I say argument in a positive light. I love to argue. Argue is debating. Debating is a club. Club is an activity. It is not a fight. And I do it as a practice for argument. Am I framing my argument in the way? Are we having an argument over something that's actually not an argument? Because we're talking about two totally different things.
Do you do that thing that I think a lot of us do who like to have these discussions where you'll argue against yourself in your own head after the conversation with someone has ended and so it starts to continue to formulate your ideas of what maybe you should have said. And it's not, as you said, it's not a negative thing in any way. Like you're not trying to defeat them. You're actually just trying to understand the problem at hand with a little bit more depth.
I think part of that then too is often you reflect on it and going, should I have been so competitive? Should I actually gone in a bit more impartial, like there is actually relevance to your point, but there's also relevance to my point as well?
Answers to your questions are, I totally have arguments with myself. Yeah. The biggest arguments are with myself.
Yeah.
100%. And in fact, the exact words you said, I said not even 3 hours ago to someone while we were talking about setting up a study design that had to be practical, but needed to be highly informative from a scientific point of view. And I'll throw a name. I was talking to Matt Tome. He's at University of Nebraska. He leads the athletic performance lab there. He's also completing his PhD. And, a person that balances regularly the scientific versus the applied side. We have arguments all the time. And I literally got off. Before I got off, I said, oh, Matt, I think I'm going to argue with myself at the end of this, but I'll talk to you next week about it and we'll see where I'm at.
Speaking of arguments about with yourself, because one of the things I'm interested to hear is your perspective of doing research, but also being a coach. In research, there's a lot more constraints and control to what you do, because to follow that scientific process, as opposed to out in the field, there's a lot more openness and opportunity to utilize multiple things at one time. Do you find challenges with that where, like in the research setting, you wish that there was more openness to see the interaction of multiple interventions at once, even though it obviously impairs the ability to determine what are the main factors involved? Or even from the other perspective of, do you, as a coach, do you wish sometimes you could actually be a lot more constrained so you could see what are the biggest things I need to focus on?
Yes to both. And so from the coach side, it is regularly a discussion. There'll be two things, and it's normally not just you making this decision, it's you and a couple of coaches, and you all have your viewpoints and your expertise. And from that, you might see, I know that we need to develop our ability to change direction. Like, it is limiting our performance in the field. These are real. It's limiting our performance in the field, particularly for our middle infielders. If we're talking about softball, like the physical ability I can coach them all I want, but if you simply cannot do something, all the coaching in the world isn't going to inspire you to move in the way I'm asking you to move. Then at the same time, we acknowledge, however, their glove work needs a little more skill, and we need to concentrate on that skill and that glove work. And we have to sit down and go, okay, are we doing it all at once? Can they take it all at once? And we just went through this process, like sitting down, all the coaches, and we tried to find the happy medium, and we went, let's do it staged. Like, if you throw everything at the athletes all at once anyway, you probably get minimal return because there's so much happening in a system that if it's...
Well, can I ask you a question on that? Because it's something that Jack and I talk about a lot. And it's got to do with that approach to how you apply stress to an individual. Mm-hmm. Are you profiling them in a sense that if someone actually does have a lot of tolerance to stress, they've got a significant training history, are you maybe more willing to not go down that staged approach? And have you chosen to go down that staged approach because, you felt that adding extra stresses, from an intervention point of view was actually too much for this group and the profile that these individual athletes had? Yeah,
for this group, it was going to be, we needed to stage it because we're already changing a lot. They're at they're, most of them, not all, but are in that age group. That's that 15 to 19-year-old. There's a lot happening. So for psychological as well as physiological reasons, you're going to challenge them. And with challenge comes literal stress, disappointment, failure, managing uncomfortable, which we talk about all the time, being comfortable and being uncomfortable. And we know there's a limit. We've all been there. Like, if you're learning all new things, how frustrating it is at the end of the day. Like, you go home and you're like, I just want a win. Like, some win. Like, I want to be good at something. So I think that's where we were coming from. But then I was coming from, we're going to assess these people. And I kind of want to know what was making the impact. Was it we focused on more the physical development? Is it actually, do we get a better impact in the skill development phase? Is there a better impact when we go for our, what we'd say, like the status quo when it comes to physical and skill? So not a lot of changes, just keeping things. And it's all about increasing self-efficacy and outcome expectancy. So our coaching psychology changes. We're paying lots of compliments. We're making minimal corrections, right? Like, that's like phase 3 for us. And, it's hard, and we change from group to group. And as this group grows, we probably won't do this again. We probably won't have this phase. We might be looking at something different. I don't know, because I don't know what they'll look like.
That makes me think, particularly with a group like this, are you having those discussions prior to about the mindset that you want them to take into it? People talk about growth mindset and all those kind of things of, this is going to be a challenge for you. We are actually implementing, new skill sets or new physical kind of stresses to you that maybe you haven't been exposed to. This is kind of some of the concepts you need to be thinking about from a psychological perspective, because it's something that I've gotten really interested in, of making sure that the environment from, the mentality that they're taking into the session actually varies depending on what you're doing. Sometimes it's, you put your head down, you're going to have to go at this point, and it's, we're willing to take a risk here or whatever that mentality needs to be. And then sometimes it's, you're very much in the lab, you're learning and you're actually exploring things, and that frustration is going to be there, not because it's physically challenging, but because emotionally as you said, you're not getting those wins. You know, I want to ask someone with more experience than myself, like, are you setting that environment in terms of the mindset that you're creating in your coaching?
Yeah, and it's literally one of the things we've just decided on in our last kind of little performance meeting. And, you know, I'll say a name now that I hope everybody knows in the future. But so Lee Godfrey is leading. She is a Gen 32 coach. So Gen 32 are you know, aspiring coaches. She's just retired from the last Olympics playing softball and now moving into coaching. And, you know, I had the benefit of working with her through like a long career, probably about 15 years of a career, and now transitioning into coaching. Now I'm on her staff, you could say. Like instead of being like a coach,
cool.
like I'm on her staff. And, you know, I enjoy the way she leads for a coach. And that was the first conversation we had, like, do we need a theme? Do we need a theme for this? Is it a theme for the whole season? Is it a theme per structure? And that's, I don't think we agreed to the words, but we definitely discussed the themes. And when we catch up again, I'm sure we'll do that. Yeah, I think we have testing this weekend or whatnot. But good coaches get that connection, and good coaches. So she's our head coach, but we had all the coaches around the table discussing. Obviously, it's like S&C, and then your skills specific coaches, and everyone was on board, and we knew our role, and we agreed on this holistic theme. So I'd have to say, and interestingly enough, she was giving us some information from her training, which is great. I get to learn more. And she did some training at the AIS, and they said that the research supports that the outcomes from the session are better with this thematic approach. And I do think it has something to do with intent, right? Like it allows people to have a specific intent. They have and the two things that I just mentioned, self-efficacy, their belief that they can actually do something. If you know what you're supposed to be doing, you're probably one step closer to being able to do it yourself. And then outcome expectancy. How you frame a session can set up what outcome they expect from it. Like if you go in and it's just another day in the gym and they lift, and they're like, yeah, it may or may not help me out there. But if you come in here and say, the reason we're doing a lot of deep range of motion today, and I know you don't love it, you don't like to sit at the bottom of the squat, is because we're trying to work on those uncomfortable positions that we have to hit when you make a really difficult backhand in the hole, or you have to dive for a ball. They only happen sometimes, but when they do, you sure as heck better be strong, agile, and mobile in those positions. And that's what we're doing here. So it makes a difference out there. Immediately, you got to frame outcome expectancy. They expect a positive outcome from this, and that drives the intent. And so the best program in the world, not done with good intent, isn't a good program. And in theory, a good program done with intent is your best combination. Let's not talk about the bad programs done with intent potentially having a good output.
Yeah, well, it reminds me a lot of the discussion from John Kiley about, you know, predictive coding and how that potentially influences those outcomes. You mentioned there some concepts that I think are really valuable in relation to how you get that information across. Is it something that for you've actually gone out of your way to develop some of the communication skills? And, you know, have you worked with any specific staff in the past? Like one thing that I tried doing very unsuccessfully, I will admit, was working with a sports psychologist to kind of upskill me on my communication. But it sounds like, you know, you and the people that you're working with are actually very, very clued into these things. Is that something that you've explored and been able to kind of build, or is it something that's, you know, naturally evolved?
It is naturally evolved, but I think many of us, probably on our own separate journeys, have sought additional information on. And actually, you asked me, what am I learning more of, or what am I digging into more? And I am digging a lot into psychology and a lot into sociology. Now, I've always been interested in sociology, just generally, but this idea of the larger environment influencing our expected behaviors, our perceived norms, and how if we want to change that in our micro environment, you have to use particular techniques in your communication and engagement. So that's
What
the area.
kind of techniques are you using?
So some of it has to do with people like to mirror. So whether you want to or not, ironically, you mirror the person you're talking to. And so that makes you hyper aware of the language that you're using, the openness that you are to tell me more, to asking questions, to engaging. And then that flips it. So that athlete is going to mirror that behavior quite readily. And that happens a lot better than instructing an individual to do something. And so, I mean, that's just a quick example. The other thing is understanding what athletes don't understand. And so this is mixed. So this is something I just proposed for a bit of a research study is the worst and best thing you can do as a coach is to mic yourself up and then listen to yourself. So there's nothing more debilitating than listening to yourself coach. There's nothing more valuable when it comes to self-reflection than listening to yourself coach. And the next step we're taking is from that, literally looking at the words and the language that we use most often. And there's some catchphrases we use in every sport. Softball's included. We have weird catchphrases. I won't be able to think of one off the cuff now, but there are a million. And, footy has it. Every sport has these weird catchphrases that we say obnoxiously, an obnoxious number of times. And we have this assumed knowledge that the athlete also knows what that catchphrase means. Man, that couldn't be further from the truth. And so
you can see that in health. I was just to say you see that in health professionals as well. You see it within physiotherapy all the time of certain language that's in vogue based on whatever particular intervention seems to be the popular thing, and certain
your favorite
language associated
activation.
with it. Yeah, exactly. It's a very loaded term, and like using terms like activation to patients, and what does that actually mean, and what assumptions do you make of what that means, and two, what does the patient actually? How do they interpret that? Because that's a term that, for many of them, they're very unfamiliar with and has no context.
That's a great one. I hadn't even thought of that one, but we'll add that to the, oh, wow. If we mic'd someone up in a physiotherapy clinic, we would get it would be.
Oh, I always notice that when we have, say, physio students come in to do placements at our clinic, or even like a new graduate working, just the language that they use because of just their experiences at university and lack of experiences working clinically.
Yeah, well, even like going into more high performance environments now, like I was a couple of years ago, a few of our colleagues work in elite sport, and I've helped them out at different times with running based stuff, and them even using, we use the word activation, they'll probably yell at me for saying this, but, using activations in the place of saying like a warm up. And I'm like, isn't that just actually a proper warm up? Like, I don't understand what an activation is. Do your activation exercises. Like I remember speaking to Jack and Jack saying, yeah, that's called a warm up. That's what that is.
Yeah, I think sometimes we get bored of a word and we think the best thing to do is to reinvent the word. And there's a lot of argument that the original word is great. I don't know if I went through this with you, but I always said one of the other great activities as a coach for coach development is to go try to coach a team that their first language isn't your first language. And it makes you cut down your vocabulary really quickly, especially if you're the one that has to learn those keywords to coach. And to be honest, I'd say that most of us coach better in that constraint.
Yeah, massively.
Than worse.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I have a couple of students who are assisting me at the moment with my on track coaching, and I say to them, it's one of my continued growth areas is I'm like yourself, as you can tell, I like talking, and I just keep talking, and I overcoach the crap out of some things, and I'm trying to say to them, like, don't do what I'm doing, which is talking all the time. And it's a really interesting process, you know, like I know that you've had some involvement with them. So I've had a number of interactions in person with the World Athletics Center, now Altus, and having conversations with people like Dan, where he just said, like, yeah, there'll be sessions where I just don't give any feedback at all until after the session. And I remember as a younger coach being like, what is he talking about? But now I totally get it. Like, I totally understand why he's doing that. And now that I actually, you know, I'm very lucky, and I'm it probably sounds very, very egoistic, but like, I'm very lucky to have athletes now doing competitions overseas. You know, I've actually got an athlete competing in Japan at the moment, and you learn really quickly, well, if you can't be there, they better know how to do some self-evaluation. Otherwise, you know, like, they're in trouble. And it's really important that you recognize that, because unfortunately these days, I think athletes at times think that better coaching is when you don't stop talking, and that you're giving them constant feedback. But actually, as you just mentioned, better coaching might be saying absolutely nothing, or just asking a question and then letting them think about that for a period of time that may make them a bit uncomfortable to actually have to explore it, but they're learning and they're actually developing their skill set so that you don't have to be there to hold their hand.
Yeah, this probably brings to, and I always think about this before I rant for an hour, and I actually say quite little while coaching. Funny enough, I'm a pretty quiet coach, because I spend all day educating, which is not being quiet. And that kind of is what framed my thought around how much you speak and when. And so there are times, like really early in the season, we're going to have a testing session, and that'll finish quick, and then we'll debrief at the end. And or sometimes if we have a rain out, we have an education session, right? So like, rain out, can't be on the field doing skills. They'll come inside, do a gym session instead, and during the education session, that's when you explain. You explain, you inform, you let people know, you actually give them definitions for all those weird words that you're saying and you're going to say repeatedly, so that they can understand context. So you need to identify times when you have 20 minutes with an athlete to educate, to do education, lots of talking. Then there's instruction. Short and sharp. We can probably tolerate about 2 different instructions, and then you're done. And then there's a cue, which should basically happen in a syllable. and that's the extent of your live coaching. And then there's the feedback, which should be a lot of questions usually. And every once in a while, maybe more in an education session, it's feedback, interaction, looking at video, you know. But that's a feedback, very separated from the activity. And that's because its intent is for education, so that later when they reflect, they're educated and their reflection has a base to stand on. But educating in the middle of your set is called taking away your warm-up. Yeah. So, yeah, and I watch it all the time, and all of us accidentally go on a rant, and I'll notice it. I'll like be talking, and I'm like, we've been standing here for 10 minutes. Luckily, you know, softball's a good sport. We stand a lot, so.
Do you think that's just a natural evolution you go through your career, where, you know, it seems that we tend to focus so much on the nuts and bolts of what we do, of like, you know, being confident of teaching someone to lift in the gym or programming, things like that. But then as you get more experience, you tend to focus more on, or at least appreciate, some of these other factors not directly associated with the intervention. Like, for instance, the language you use, the intention that you have, the timing of your language, all these things.
Yeah, and it's a necessary evolution. So I know we're reflecting on like should we redesign courses, and should we add more things? And I'm thinking about this all the time. This is definitely an area I can change my mind in. But you know, should we add more communication classes and things like that? And I'm like, you know, it wouldn't hurt. But what I'm saying is, you can't learn everything at once. Just like I'm not going to change 18 things in your program at once. So it's funny how when we go to educate ourselves and expectation of the progression of our own personal development, all of a sudden we throw out all the rules that we have for athlete development and we pretend like we're not just replicating the development process. So I've been thinking, do we do more interaction, more difficult conversations, more, critical thinking? Well, we should all do more critical thinking, but the communication process, I think the reason it happens over time is simply at first you have to talk a lot to get a good idea out, like what I'm doing. Then you realize, oh, I really know what's important. And since you know what's important, you have to say fewer things. But to know what's important, first you have to do you need time under your belt to have hundreds of bad ideas and realize, oh, this one good idea that I said amongst the 99 bad ones, that was a good one. I think as you get better, you don't have to have so many ideas for one of them to be good. And by ideas, I mean you don't have to pick all the things that are flaws, quote unquote, with an athlete before you realize the likely one to be influential to work on at the time.
There's so many things that come up from you saying this. I'm thinking of so many different questions, but I think that we've sort of spoken around some of your actual expertise and research. So I think it would be nice to actually probe some of that. One of the things that I know Jack was really keen to look at was the influence of some of the tissue capacities and tissue qualities and how that actually influences biomechanics. We always think about this concept of, the output, and there's obviously other factors. I know there's environmental and ecological factors involved, but what you observe biomechanically generally is a combination of, their understanding and ability to execute a skill set versus, in addition to what their actual underlying capabilities are from a physical performance perspective. And I know a lot of your research and the work that you've done with different colleagues has looked at, okay, well, how much do those underlying physical capacities actually influence what we get out in terms of your biomechanical function? Obviously, you're the expert in some of these areas. Can you explore and break that down for us a little bit?
Yeah. So think about, if you reflect on my career, you see why the order of my research and understanding of this, or my growth of understanding, has gone in the order it has, right? I started as a strength conditioning coach. You should make people stronger and fitter. That's where I started. I realized that making people stronger and fitter did help them move. Then I started getting it more into the sports science, and I was always a keen person on the movement side, as in observing movement. But I guess being an S&C, I'll readily admit my early training had little to do with movement and mostly to do with prescription, right? And definitely I could tell you how to squat, right? So over time I realized you definitely could get people stronger in lots of different ways and fitter in lots of different ways, but it was a mixed bag, to describe it, whether all those people moved more effectively, right? Or efficiently, depending what you want to measure, whether it's effectiveness or efficiency. And I went, okay, well, what is that? And that's when I started getting more into biomechanics, measuring what we moved. And then I went, oh, well, now I have to explain why. And so with this tissue, how does it transfer into movement or improve movement? The short answer is the first thing you typically assess is someone can or can't move a particular way. So you have them go run, and you're like, oh, I don't know. Can you go through just a little bit bigger range of motion? The person that has, and I hate to do this to people, but soccer players, footy, like football world game, football, soccer, they run a particular way, and it's usually with restricted hip flexion. There's a reason. They do so much on the ball drill that keeping your foot down to the ground is important for being able to touch the ball, right? So, and you're like, but could you run with greater range of motion? And what do? You just do a really easy, you have them sprint again, but you just put the hurdles down, right? Or the wickets, like 5-inch wickets. And if when they run, all of a sudden they look pretty good, they're running almost just as fast, you go, oh, well, that's their choice. They can run a different way, but they choose not to. Then that means that that person actually has the physical capability, but their skill acquisition, their repeated motor programming, it's just that they run that way. And in that one, I'm like, oh, okay, that's great. Don't have to worry about that. But if you have a person that then you put them through that and they like knock over every single wicket, this may or may not be a real scenario. then you're like, ooh, so you can't. Like you literally can't. And that's a physical restriction, can or can't. And I've just kind of made a framework, and it's not perfect, but we all have to simplify things into boxes because that's how we work and make decisions.
Yeah.
Series of decisions trees. Can or can't, does or doesn't, will or won't. And so it's like taking away more and more and more. And that's pretty much what I've amounted this tissue versus, I guess it's motor control argument. And they're hand in hand, like they're interplaying all the time. And I think that's something that Daniel Kadlik has just recently written a really great article trying to combine the perception action approaches with traditional strength and conditioning approaches. And we got Matt Dix, who is a skill acquisition specialist, on board to make sure that we were adequately and appropriately representing those principles, because I think that can happen is we have people writing papers from an outside view. And so we had to come and meet and make sure we were happy with each other's language and how we're interpreting all of the existing literature. And he kind of goes through this framework that makes a justification for this. It's an and. It's tissue capacity and motor control, and one opens the opportunity for use, but doesn't guarantee the use of. And I think that's where we are in S&C.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way of looking at it, because I always go through this battle, and I'm doing it at the moment where, and I'm lucky enough to be able to work with some of the Victorian Institute of Sport staff, and one of the staff members were talking about the concept of, maximal velocity sprinting, and I was saying to him, at the end of the day, it really does come down to the simplicity of, stride length and stride frequency. And he was asking me, questions around like, well, which one are you queuing? And I said, well, actually they work in harmony. So it's exactly, what you're saying of like, you can't rob Peter to pay Paul. And as they evolve, as the athlete gets better at being able to, say if you improve their physical capabilities in a certain area, whether it's elastic function or, their power output or whatever, they can probably take longer strides. However, like you can't do that at the detriment of lowering your stride frequency. They need to at least maintain it. And so as they progress through their career, you're consistently playing this game where it's like, okay, this one's got a little bit better. I need to up this. And then I need to keep exposing them to different tasks that are going to bring that out and make sure that I'm pushing those parameters up together. And that makes me think of something that we wanted to ask you, which was around, constraints-based learning. And a constraints-based approach in regards to, biomechanical inputs and skill acquisition. How do you see the use of that? And do you think that we're getting that right? Or do you think it's, more of a flavor of the month kind of approach at the moment?
Yeah, anytime something becomes, in this case, it would be like to become in vogue, because like
it was around forever, yeah.
It honestly is just coaching 101, but is to guide someone to do something because they're not listening to you, is what it is. Because clearly we talk too much. So why in God's green earth are they going to listen to you? Like you got to guide them some other way. I think I'm just happy we're aware. I'm happy that people have refound this and are considering it. Where I think we are is we don't know why we're using it. Like people are using it lots, and in my view, probably we just need to revisit what percentage of the time you should be using a constraint versus enabling athletes to move unconstrained but at maximal intent. and ensure that you sharpen said sword too. And I think we're just on the side where people are using it so much and in relatively unplanned ways. So I don't know what their why is. Like every time I place a constraint, I know why I'm doing it. Someone might use the exact same constraint, but their why is totally different. But my why is related to what I'm trying to get out of the session, what I think this athlete needs to work on, or what I think is going to lead an athlete to a particular range of motion, or to expose a tissue to, high velocity lengthening under an eccentric phase that is really hard to get in the gym, right? Like long length, high velocity lengthening. That's why sprinting is such a potent, tissue.
Stressor. Yeah.
Yes, 100%. And so I use it because I'm biased, and I came originally in my mindset from a strength and conditioning mindset. How can I strengthen and build the tolerance of a body? I use constraints to explore ranges of motion and to guide people through movements that they won't do without me guiding it or without that constraint. So part of that is skill acquisition. Sometimes it's more towards that. Sometimes it's me going, this is a thing that is really hard to get the type of velocity and actual force at the muscle in the gym because it's just hard, So I'm going to use a constraint to ensure that, we'll go back to that soccer player, to ensure that at high velocities, that individual is getting, they're striking down after the knee's been in a lot of flexion, hip flexion, and that means that during the phase of strike down, that they've gone through a bigger range of motion and they might be hitting with greater force. And that's happening with a great eccentric load, and I'm going to get some great tissue adaptation from that. They might not be running faster, by the way, because it may not be my intent. My intent for that might be exposure to the tissue. And if we keep building that, then maybe down the line, it also manifests into some skill acquisition or open that tissue up to be able to effectively apply more force so that they can run faster. But I definitely play.
I love that. I love the fact that you're actually recognizing that. I don't know if I've thought about it exactly like that, but I love the fact that you're saying, like, sometimes I'm actually chasing something that I know is not necessarily about the performance, but I'm trying to get this stressor because I can't get it in another way. I think that's a super intelligent way of looking at it. And I think it opens up, particularly when you're talking about range of motion, that the ideas around like movement variability and, how exposing people to these, this variability is actually really important for potentially their overall skill set in movement. Do you want to give us a little bit of your ideas on that? Because I know that it's something that you're well versed in.
Yeah. So again, this is a topic that I always thought was kind of inherent to coaching is that you are trying to get in, like, for me, the definition of an athlete is a person that can perform under any kind of situation you put in front of them. An athlete is not a person can only perform under perfect situations. An athlete is versatile. They can manage variability. And so I always thought, okay, when you throw something at an athlete and they've mastered it, obviously the next thing you do is make it harder, make it longer, all the things that are like programming 101. But being really drawn to movement, I kind of use that constraint approach sometimes to expose the athlete to new positions and ranges of motion. And so that came to us really reading the literature on movement variability. And we were like, wow, this is wild. One, because it hasn't had a lot, like a huge amount in the sport context. There's a lot on movement variability in the broader context. The entire discipline of motor control has done an exceptional amount of work, and other disciplines. So like in biology, and they've looked at variability in basically vertebrates all throughout, anything from chickens to hens to rats, mice, anything. They've studied their movement variability. But when it comes to sport, we've kind of like dabbled in it. And on top of that, we just disagree constantly. So I'll give credit to Jake Cowan. So Jake Cowan's at Tasmanian Institute of Sport, just completing his PhD as well, and he's a lead author in a paper that we just published on that, and he's phenomenal. Actually, you should talk to him. So
We'll try and get him on for sure.
I'll briefly summarize that, but the general definition for it, I'm actually going to read it so that we don't stuff up the definition, because the whole paper is about how people stuff up definitions or don't give them at all. So normal variations in motor performance across multiple repetitions of a task. All right, piece of cake. End story, right? Easy? Not so easy. What we found is people were talking about different types of variability, but just throwing the blanket banner of movement variability, right? So
and what is normal too?
Yeah. Well, that's normal in that context. When we actually, it was a scoping review, so you just like get all the literature out there and be like, what's been done before is the gist. And in doing that, it really pulled out that we were arguing because we don't make good arguments. This goes full circle to what I said. I love to argue, but if we're all sitting here arguing and we're actually not asking the same question, we're not having an argument. So we kind of summarized it into three. You've got strategic variability, execution variability, and outcome variability. And when you look at the three types, they make complete sense. So we'll start with outcome because it's like the easy one. And Jake quite likes basketball. So we use that as an example. So outcome variability is really straightforward. It's kind of like, did you make or miss the shot? So it's often, the variable is usually categorical. So it's did or did not. There is no try. It's Yoda quotes all day, every day. And so obviously someone could have no variability in outcome, meaning they make 100% of their free throws, but how they executed that free throw shot probably did vary joint to joint, for example, for many, if not all of those shots. So if in the same question we're like, is free throw shooting, is there a high movement variability in free throw shooting? One person could say, well, these people know they make 100% of their shots because they're measuring movement variability by outcome variability. And this other paper is over here being like 100%. It's highly variable because they make small adjustments at the finger, the wrist, and the elbow every single free throw shot. And so it's highly variable. And you're like, well, great. So you're arguing. You say it's not variable. You say it is variable. And it's because you haven't set the argument up because we haven't defined these words. And the last one, the strategic variability. So execution, I alluded to, it's the same thing. You're shooting free throws over and over again, and you've got these small adjustments, usually at the joint level, but it could be other things you're measuring. Strategic, I'll stay with basketball as an example, is that'd be like saying, the free throw shot is the same as a jumper, as the same as a fadeaway, the same as a jab step jump, right? And these are all variations of movement. They have different whys though. And so if you go, we're going to look at the variability of shooting in the field, so say 3-point shots, but that athlete sometimes uses a jab step, sometimes it's just a straight jumper. There's that strategic variability. And then on top of that, you might actually be measuring execution. So how their height of their release changes, how the elbow flexion changes, etc. So people are arguing and they may not have been measuring within the same strategy, or they're measuring across strategies, but looking at execution. And so we kind of went, all right, your first thing is lay some definitions down. Movement variability is generally how much you vary from trial to trial to trial. That's such a really vague definition that when we say movement variability, you can use that term. It's real broad, but there's subdimensions to it, or what we say are types. You've got strategic, execution, and outcome. And, that kind of goes into when people are like, is it good or bad? And I go, well, it depends. And everyone hates that. And I was like, well, it depends which one you're talking about. So that's kind of where we are and where we started, and the really great work Jake's done. And he's done some great little studies as follow-up to that, looking at jumping variability.
If you put your coach's hat on, how do you start? Where does your mind go? Where does it start ticking? Because as soon as you're talking about that, my mind's going, okay, what am I going to do with that? I'm going to go read that paper. Where does your mind go with that? You know, do you start thinking of like, oh, maybe I should be doing more of this, or maybe I should explore this? You know, what happens in your mind when you start having these conversations with your colleagues?
So I'm really good at looping things back around to something we talked about. And I swear, like what I study is what we practice, is what I argue with coaches every day. Like my whole life's a big circle. So if you think about the three kind of sections that I talked about when we were talking about, well, what's going to be our themes? What's going to be our themes in softball? And early on, you know, we might be focusing on the physical part of that. And if I'm going to say, what am I going to focus on there, is when I'm really trying to explore the physical side, and I'm going to make us better middle infielders, which means you need to be able to get to lots of balls, and you need to be able to handle and tolerate deep ranges of motion and do it upright and do it in comfortable ranges of motion. I go, oh, my practice schedule and how I design practice should be focusing more on strategic variability, right? So I actually could marry our themes as we go. And I don't care about outcome as much, because it's like you're going to overthrow first a billion times. This is not the time in the season I care about that. I'll get to that later. And then we get to the next phase where we're focusing on skills. We focus on skills, and we'll do a little bit of block, although we'll mix it up, and practice schedule is a whole nother podcast. But within a skill, you know, say we're just doing backhands over and over again, we're looking at execution variability. So being able to perform a backhand, but with all those variations within that backhand. And I know you can see me backhanding a ball right now, but you can't. And then when we get to the last phase where I go, okay, all things are off, stop changing things about the skills. Please stop changing things about the physicality. It's just status quo there. Keep it steady. And now we just want you in your head, psychological safety 101. You're great. You're doing good things, because we're focusing on outcome. However you get there, whether you change your strategy, whether there's a variation in execution variability, I don't care. We're focusing to make sure we're maximizing outcome variability, or maximizing the positive outcome, reducing the outcome variability for the positive, hopefully. And
Fantastic.
So, although baseball's not a great example because batting 300 is positive, but yeah, we do the best we can. So it all ties hand in hand with everything that you're doing. And so I think that's why those three things came up, and they make a lot of sense.
One question that has popped into my head, because it was a conversation that I had. I was involved in a study talking to coaches about the role of testing. And I have a thought about this, but I would like to get your opinion. Obviously, as a coach and a researcher, I'm sure, you know, in your mind, you want to have those time points where you're actually like, this is information that I want. Now, I'll give you my opinion later, but I want to hear what you say first, because what role do you see, you know, specific testing having in a, you know, sporting performance environment, maybe versus something like continuously monitoring certain capabilities or outputs? Do you see them as being separate? Do you see them being the same? And do you think there is a role for those, you know, oh, we're doing a testing day, or we're doing a testing block, or that kind of concept?
Yeah. So my ideal is that it's integrated. It's not separated. But I still haven't been able to fully go away from that for different reasons. Sometimes it's logistical, like we don't have the type of wearables to be able to monitor performance for some of the athletes, and so you still got to run through your timing gates. So the ideal is you have a mixture of both, because I think both are susceptible to different errors. And since you never put all your chips in one basket of making a decision solely on one piece of information, I think having opposing baskets is good. So I'll go to softball. We'll stay in theme. We're looking at things that can be monitored over time. So that's wearable. So whether that's fixed to our bat, goes to our bat. Sorry, my headphones just said low.
That's all right.
So, you know, looking at swing velocity, swing plane, etc., like that. Then the other side of it is, at the end of the day, I just want to know that physical capability. Like, are we progressing there? And I suppose my ongoing monitoring, I probably gear it towards the skill because I don't know the time frame, can't estimate the time frame, and it's so highly individual to when people get what skill acquisition specialists that exponential like it's the all of a sudden like, wow, I improved. That's so random. You need ongoing monitoring to find that. Where physically, I can, it still pretty much fits with blocks. Like physical is like less random with your improvements. It's relatively linear because it's like work in, literally work out. And so that's why I keep them separate. So ongoing monitoring is probably where we need to go if we want to quantify skill enhancement. Physical monitoring, like it's actually the easier one. It's pretty linear. So capturing it at a couple times in the season is good to go. Ideally, you manifest it within the daily practice environment, but if you can't and you have a good setup, you do it a couple times a season, and there you go. So that's kind of where I'm thinking right now and where I pro-cons it. So physical is great. Skill is what I really want to know, but it's complicated, and so it requires that regular monitoring because we don't know when you get that. I don't know. It's an epiphany of skill acquisition.
Do you think that it seems like you've married together multiple fields? You've lost your headphones, have you?
I think so. Give her a moment. Oh.
Just for those listening who are wondering what's going on, Sophia's just lost her headphones for a second there. We can't hear you quite yet. Your microphone might be off there.
Can we change that or?
One thing.
We've got you back now.
Sorry, someone's calling me.
Do you need to get that?
Yeah, well, I have a meeting at 1.
Right.
Well,
we'll let you go if you need to run.
Awesome.
Did you need to go? If you do, we can
I will.
wrap up.
Is there anything you wanted to tidy it up on that?
No, we just, more than anything, and apologies for the quick wrap up here, everyone. We are so appreciative for your time. We know that you probably don't want to, probably makes you uncomfortable, but you are a world-renowned expert, and we actually are very, very grateful for people like yourself being willing to do this and give your time, because learning from people like yourself is extremely pleasurable for us, even as individual practitioners. So thank you so much, Sophia. We really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll get the chance to chat with you again in the future. I
was about to say, I think there's definitely a part 2 here. I was very much enjoying sitting back and listening to this.
So thank you so much.
I appreciate Jack and John, and it's good. I like chatting with you guys, so it's great. I wish I had more time right now, but
that's okay.
Not a problem.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Bye.